Hello, and welcome to the Storyteller's Thread, a monthly podcast devoted to young adult literature and the art of storytelling. I'm your host, Sean Connors. On each episode, we invite an author for young adults to take us inside their work, and in doing so, to talk about their writing process, their inspiration for writing for young readers, and the general ins and outs of earning a living as a professional storyteller. So, whether you're a compulsive reader, an aspiring writer, a teacher or librarian, or simply a frustrated reader who's counting the hours until you get home and dive back into that novel that's waiting for you on your nightstand, this is the place for you. Hello everyone, it's June 1st, 2019, and with Memorial Day weekend now in the rearview mirror, summer has unofficially begun here in the United States. This month I'm talking with Jennifer Donnelly, the critically acclaimed author of several books for young people, including A Northern Light, These Shallow Graves, Revolution, and as of just last month, Stepsister. I'm not going to lie, I've been a huge fan of Jennifer's writing from the moment that I first read A Northern Light, and I was beyond excited to talk with her about her work. I'll just go ahead and tell you, this was a fanboy moment for me, and Jennifer did not disappoint. I can't wait to share our conversation with you, as I think you're going to learn a lot about writing from listening to her talk about her work. I know that I did. First, though, I want to thank you for taking time to listen to this podcast. I know there's a million other things that you could be doing right now, and I appreciate the fact that you've set aside time to listen. So again, thank you. I'd also like to recruit your help promoting the program. If you know someone who's interested in young adult literature, whether it's a teacher, librarian, aspiring writer, or just a reader, please let them know about it. It'll take just a second of your time, but you'll help me out considerably, and you'll help keep this a viable project for me. Okay, as I said, I'm excited to share my conversation with Jennifer with you, so let's get straight to it. I hope that you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed talking with her. Born and raised in New York State, Jennifer Donnelly attended the University of Rochester, where she majored in English literature and European history. She later took up residence in New York City, where, after 10 years of work, she published The Tea Rose, the first book in a trilogy set in the East End of London late in the 19th century. It was her second novel, though, A Northern Light, that catapulted Donnelly to fame. Her first book for young adults, A Northern Light, drew for inspiration on a real-life criminal case that occurred in New York's Adirondack region at the turn of the 20th century, and which Donnelly recalled having learned about from her grandmother. The case centered on a teenage girl, Grace Brown, who was murdered, presumably as a matter of convenience, by the father of her unborn child. Devastated by Brown's story, Donnelly used it as inspiration for her protagonist, Maddie Goki, to escape the patriarchal systems that threatened to ensnare her in her rural community. In addition to receiving Britain's prestigious Carnegie Award, A Northern Light won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and was named a Prins Honor Book by the American Library Association. Time magazine has since named Northern Light one of the 100 best young adult books of all time. In 2010, Donnelly published her second young adult novel, Revolution, a sweeping tale of two teenage girls, one in present-day Brooklyn, the other in Paris during the French Revolution, whose stories interweave as they struggle to make sense of tragedies that befall them. A case study of trauma and depression, School Library Journal called Revolution a sumptuous feast of a novel, rich in mood, character, and emotion. Donnelly is also the author of the award-winning 4-volume Waterfire saga for middle grade readers. In May 2019, she published Stepsister, a feminist reimagining of the Cinderella story told from the perspective of Isabel, one of Cinderella's evil stepsisters. The bulletin of the Center for Children's Books praised Stepsister for exposing cultural myths that suffocate girls in the name of likability and pit them against one another in the name of beauty. Despite traveling to promote Stepsister, Donnelly generously made time to talk with me about her passion for stories, her writing process, and the cathartic role that art and literature play in her life and the lives of her characters. How did you come to telling stories? Do you remember when you first began to seriously entertain the idea of becoming an artist?
I don't know if it was a conscious understanding. I was very fortunate to be raised by a mother who was an amazing verbal storyteller and still is. She's still alive. She's German and was a young child in Germany during the war. And she told me a lot of stories about her life as a young kid growing up in Germany during the war. She might tell me one day what it felt like to be a small child and running for her life from her house to an air raid shelter, only to come out a few hours later and discover that her house and everything in it had burned to the ground. Or she might tell me a story about this kid in her neighborhood, Herbert, who was the neighborhood snot-nose. And every time this kid got into trouble, he had joined the Hitler Youth. He would run and put on his Hitler Youth uniform because when he was wearing it, he was the property of the state and no one, not even his parents, could touch him. Or she might tell me about her friend Harold, who was a young boy who had cerebral palsy, and they would play with this child in a wheelbarrow. They would sort of wheel him around. And she would tell me what it was like when suddenly his mother would come running and grab him and bring him in the house. And what she was doing was hiding him in a closet to protect this boy from the Nazi health inspectors. So some people might think, oh, wow, this is a lot for a young child to process, or what harrowing stories. And maybe they're right, I don't know. But I wasn't scared. I was fascinated. I would sit up in my bed and say, what happened next, Mom? What did you do? How did you feel? And I think what was happening was my mother was making an historian out of me to some degree and also a novelist. I was just fascinated by the effects that history has on people and how it shapes us and defines us. It can save us. It can doom us. And I'm still that way to this day.
I think it's really interesting that you respond to that question by locating your affinity for story and storytelling in your mother's biography. In recent years, you've been writing other genres, but you're arguably best known for your historical fiction. What is it that draws you to historical fiction?
I think it's just being drawn to the crimes and the mistakes of history. And when I write, I guess what I'm doing is attempting to do them over in my small way and to make them right, if only on paper.
Characters in your books often possess a deep-rooted passion for the arts. In A Northern Light and in These Shallow Graves, it's literature and writing. In Revolution, it's music. Can you talk about the role of art in both your work and your own life?
That's an interesting question, and it's actually, I've never been asked that question before, and I'm just sort of reviewing it in my mind, and you're right. I think it must be because my characters, like me, share this need for art and sort of view it as not just comfort and solace and inspiration, but salvation. At the worst times of my life, I turn to art, I turn to poetry, I turn to Shakespeare for the sustenance I need and sort of a signpost to the path forward. It's always sustained me in times of trouble. I've always turned to books. I still do. And I think I must have, that must be in my character's DNA from me. It's an interesting connection that you draw there.
Well, references to canonical literature certainly abound in your books. Can you talk about your relationship with literature and how that informs the kind of stories that you're telling?
It's just, having told you about my mom and her early storytelling, from a young age, it brought me up to have this expectation of words and stories as a way of delighting in my world, but also understanding it in my world. Mm-hmm. And I think my characters have that too. They don't really turn much to psychology or to religion to find their way out of trouble, to find their way forward, to find meaning and understanding. They all sort of turn to music and literature, and I think they share that with me.
In what ways do you find yourself doing that? You talked a little bit about turning to literature as almost a signpost of sorts. In what sense do you mean that?
I mean that I need help, and I sometimes I just feel, so despaired. I'm sure as many people do. All you have to do is sit down at night and turn on the news or read it on your news feed, and, and this just a feeling of despair and darkness descends, whether it's on the geopolitical stage or the local stage. And it sort of, makes a feeling of helplessness. And then I'll open Shakespeare. I'll read Macbeth. I'll read Lear. I'll read Hamlet. And I suddenly feel connected to all these people who lived centuries ago. And I know that Shakespeare and his contemporaries, battled these feelings of despair and helplessness. And I know that, since Shakespeare is drawing on history, he must have felt that people before him battled those feelings. And so I suddenly feel, sort of strengthened and lifted up and understood. And that kind of gives me the strength to keep going and do what I can as an artist to try to help somebody else. I've been helped so often by reading, whether it's Shakespeare, whether it's Jeanette Winterson, whether it's Emily Dickinson. And I want to in turn offer that perhaps to a younger reader or an older reader, and give them the sort of sustenance that I've been given my whole life by authors.
I think it's really interesting. You talk about locating your need for art, need for literature in the time period we're living in. And that totally resonates with me. I've talked before about starting this podcast largely because I was in need of a creative outlet.
Right.
And I wanted to talk with creative people about their work as a way to sort of cope with everything that's been going on. Mm-hmm. You sort of alluded to this in your answer, but when you're writing, are you thinking about that sort of a relationship with your reader as creating something that can be useful in their lives?
I am thinking about it. My first order is to understand the story I'm trying to tell and get that down and in a logical and hopefully compelling, beguiling, artistic way. So it's that story that's sort of directing me at first. What is it? How does it want to be told? Who are these characters? Who are these people? How do I get to know them? And then after that, I'm sort of thinking about the reader more. It's not sort of a conscious, will the reader like this? Will the reader hate this kind of thing at first? Are
you writing more for yourself?
I am at times writing for myself. It's like answering the critic. Is this any good? Am I getting this down right? And then I turn around and write for the reader. I want them to be delighted, and I want to sort of I want to kind of take them by the hands. I'm like this overexcited kindergartner and saying, look what I found. This is show and tell. I've got to share this with you. So I guess the question is a bit of both, depending on what part of the process I'm at that moment.
I want to come back to your relationship with literature and the influence that it has on your work. Your book, Revolution, borrows its structure from Dante's The Inferno.
Yes.
And I've always been curious. Have you read James Joyce's Dubliners?
Yes, I have. I've read James Joyce's Ulysses. He is one of the most important authors to me, and his work is just so formative. And I discovered him, I think I read him in high school and didn't click. And then I had just an amazingly talented college professor and did, I think, 2 Joyce classes with him, sort of a broader survey of Joyce and his contemporaries and then Joyce. And it was like being handed the keys to the kingdom. I was just so blown away by this genius, by his soul, by his heart. So he was hugely formative to me and still is a writer that I just admire so much, so deeply.
I've always wondered whether your novel, Northern Light, drew on his short story, Evelyn, for inspiration.
It's possible that it did. I'm not trying to think back to the story, trying to think back to my story. I'm not making a clear connection, but it all goes into the hopper and comes out in strange ways sometimes.
In Evelyn, it's the story of a young girl living at the turn of the 20th century whose mother's died. She's living with an alcoholic father and responsible for raising her siblings, and an opportunity to leave Dublin with a man that she meets presents itself. And at the end of the story, she's standing on the docks waiting to board the ship, and they're calling the ship's departure, and she starts up the walkway and she clutches the rail, and she has this moment. He says something to the effect of, all the seas are churning in her heart, and can she leave? And she ultimately chooses not to. So you can see sort of how I make the connection with Maddie's story, that we're even
absolutely.
at the train station, leaving her home and having those same thoughts. Is she really going to get on this train and go?
And go, yeah. That it must have been there. It must have been burbling. That must have been an influence.
Well, and canonical literature, I suspect, influences your work in other ways. It's not just limited to your referencing canonical titles or authors or well-known literary characters. Again, in The Northern Light, and also in these Shallow Graves, you even capture the spirit of the literary movement that was in vogue at the times that those stories are set, naturalism. Is that something you're cognizant of doing as a writer?
I wish I could say so, but you're giving me too much credit, Sean. It's sort of, the way it works for me is some sort of thing, an idea, a snatch of a letter, a bit of a poem, music. It gets hold of me as another story, like usually a fiction sort of thing. That was definitely the inspiration for Revolution. And it stirs, or it just engenders so much emotion in me that I have to work that emotion out the way writers do by writing a story. With A Northern Light, it was Grace Brown's letters. My mom and I were in the Adirondacks at a bookstore in Old Forge, and she held up a copy of Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy and said, "Have you ever read this?" And I hadn't, so she bought it for me, and she bought a book of a nonfiction account of the case as well, of Grace Brown's story, and I read them both, and I was just blown away by Grace. I could feel her, I could hear her. Both books, Dreiser fictionalizes Grace's letters, and this nonfiction account, did not fictionalize the letters, but in them I heard Grace's voice, and I was just haunted by her. And the fact that this lovely, beautiful young life had been so cruelly ended at the age of 19, and Grace kind of took up residence in my home, in my heart, and I had to deal with her, had to deal with what happened to her, had to have something good come from this death, and that something good was Maddie. So it's not a conscious decision, really. I'm sure I'm a product of all my influence, but it's sort of being, grabbed and embraced by this ghost and having to follow the story where it leads to try to get rid of the ghost ultimately.
I've always connected your historical fiction to naturalism, not all of your historical fiction, but several of your books to naturalism, because of its concern with depicting characters who are dominated by their social environments and their heredity, and the underlying assumption that being that those things are unavoidable determinants in a person's life. I think of your books oftentimes in conversation with the issues that Edith Wharton would have written about, and she sat her stories in a time period that's similar to the one that you write about in several of your books. What I think is interesting in your stories is the unavoidable determinant in your characters' lives is oftentimes patriarchal systems.
I would say that's absolutely true in A Northern Light, without a doubt. Maddie's father is, a very strong-willed, very damaged man, and very much the ruler of the roost, and determines, at least in the beginning of the book, what she's going to do and what path she's going to follow or not follow.
And in these Shallow Graves as well.
Yes, absolutely. Jo is a product of her society, which happens to be a wealthy turn of the last century society, as opposed to Maddie's, which was a poor rural setting. But yes, absolutely, they're both very much worked upon, corralled, contained by societal forces, both women.
In addition to writing for young adults, you're also the author of the Tea Rose series, which is historical fiction for adults. Your novel Revolution centers on a teenage girl who's experienced trauma and whose despair brings her to the brink of suicide. That book is unbelievably complex, both in its allusion to classic art and literature, and also in its mining of the relationship between the present and the past. As far as I'm concerned, when I closed the book, it could well be an adult novel, which begs the question, what defines a work of literature as young adult? Is that merely a label that serves marketing purposes, do you think?
I think it can be at times. For me, it's who am I trying to talk to, who am I trying to reach? I mean, I want anyone, of any age to read my stories if they can benefit from those stories, if they can enjoy those stories. So I don't like to sort of, place the reader in I don't like to pigeonhole the reader, and readers refuse to be pigeonholed anyway. You can try your best. They're going to do, luckily and happily, what they want to do. But it's wanting to talk to teenage girls, both and teenage boys, both in A Northern Light and in Revolution. And in A Northern Light, to just try to get the message across to them. Choose your own path in life, no matter how hard, that is. And when you're a teenager, it's very hard. You have so many people telling you who to be and what path to follow. But I really want kids to just sort of be still for a moment and go into themselves and find out what it is that they want to do and who they are. And in Revolution, it was very much about depression and sort of wading through that horribleness of despair that the main character finds herself in.
I'm just thinking about your comment about wanting the reader to be able to look inward. Can you talk about the importance of that for you as a writer?
Yeah, you have to. I mean, and there is so much. Teens have so much competing for their attention, the internet and television, film, movies, all media of all sorts. And when you're that age, everyone's an authority figure to you. And you're starting to emerge and you're starting to ask, from childhood, you're at the sort of borderlands between childhood and adulthood. And it's often a very scary place to be. And it's hard, to have that silence and to listen to it. But to me, it's the basis of the rest of your life and hopefully your happiness, whether that happiness is, just as a person or professionally. You have to quiet down to ask those questions of yourself. Who am I and what do I want out of my life? Not to be told, but to listen.
I've sort of been struggling to figure out the timeline for your writing career. The Tea Rose, the first book, The Tea Rose, came out right around the time A Northern Light did. Mm-hmm. Were you writing for one audience first, adult or young adult? Were you writing those books concurrently?
I was writing The Tea Rose. I started first with The Tea Rose, and that was, I probably got the ideas for that when I was a teenager. When I was in college, I had a year abroad. I was at the University of Rochester and spent time at Birkbeck College at the University of London. And during that time, I lived in the West End of London, but spent a great deal of time in the East End. I had this wonderful landlord, Clark Hanford, and he was a designer and an artist and really an amazing person, just so fascinating and interesting and artistic. And he asked me one day over a cup of tea, have you ever been to the East End of London, to the markets there? And I hadn't. So he said, I think this was on a Saturday, and he said, all right, that's it. We're going to Brick Lane tomorrow. I'll pick you up. And this is some ungodly hour, I think at 4:30 in the morning. And so I was waiting outside my apartment building in the dark, and suddenly around the corner comes Clark in a Model A Ford, of course. And off we go, driving from the West End in the pitch black to the East End of London. This was back in the 80s, probably 84, early 85, and the East End had started to undergo rebuilding and gentrification, but it was certainly not what it is today. And so we're driving in the dark, and we're leaving the sort of Ladbroke Grove, Notting Hill, London with beautiful little houses, and we're getting into a darker, sort of scrappier, more tumble-down industrial London. And Clark pulls in under this old, train bridge and cuts the engine, and it's pitch black. And I'm suddenly thinking, how well do I know this person? And we get out of the car, and I hear music, and it's singing. And what it was the costermongers in the Brick Lane Market, still singing their wares as the sun was just starting to lighten the sky, and one is singing "My Oranges Are Better Than His," and they're flirtatious and they're ruddy-cheeked. And I felt as if Clark and I had traveled in this Model A time machine back to the London of Dickens and Hogarth, and I was just smitten. I was completely in love. And I walked around with Clark, through this tumble-down market, little back lanes and garages and sheds that people kept their wares in and opened for the Sunday Brick Lane Market. And there was a group of men with loops in their eyes passing around gold jewelry with big wads of cash, and people selling jellied eels, and the Cockney language and accent is just so muscular and beautiful, and I was head over heels. I had discovered a whole world, and I sort of delved deeper into it after that day. I learned more about the East End of London, how it was the cradle of the early labor movement, how it was the London of Jack the Ripper. And most important, how these people who had so little, they had so little money, their lives were so precariously lived in the 1880s, were so strong-willed and accomplished so much, and were just two-fisted and muscular about their language and their life. And I was off and running. I'd studied Jack the Ripper. I studied the labor movement. I studied the dock strike and the East End and its people. And I knew I wanted to write about it. And that was how I started to write The Tea Rose, which led to The Winter Rose and The Wild Rose. But with all the sort of idealism and optimism and stupidity of youth, I jumped right in, not knowing how to write. And it took me about 10 years to finish this manuscript, start to finish, working early in the morning, before work, getting up at 4:30, writing on weekends, writing on, when I was supposed to be taking holidays or vacations, and finally had what I thought was a finished manuscript, but it was far from finished. I found an agent, Simon Lipscar at Writer's House, who bravely agreed to take me on. And he said, the good news is that you can write, and the bad news is we've got to trim this thing down, and you have to work a lot on structure and suspense and narrative pacing. And we did that. That took another 2 years. And then Simon submitted this book, The Tea Rose, to pretty much every publishing house in New York City. And I was then rejected by every publishing house in New York City, which was devastating. At that point, I'd spent, 12 years of my life on this manuscript, and I'd been cobbling together a life out of freelance jobs. And, thank God my husband had a good job and he supported us, or otherwise we would have starved. And I was in such despair at that point, but Simon kind of pulled me in off the ledge and said, hang on, we'll resubmit again in 6 months. And we did. And a lovely editor named Sally Kim in St. Martin's bought the manuscript, and it wasn't for very much money, but I didn't care. That night, I literally got on my dining room table with a bottle of champagne and danced, because I was finally going to publish this book and be a real author. And I'm happy to say I had the exact opposite experience with The Northern Light. So the Tea Rose was finished first. I sold a picture book around that time, too, called Humble Pie. I think that was my first actual literary sale. And then I had an idea for a Northern Light, and I was able to sell that based on a proposal, which was maybe 40 written pages, and then the rest of the book very mapped out. And that book actually went to auction. So I've had where various publishers were competing for it. So I've had sort of the hardest and the best experiences in publishing.
What led you? Was it simply the story that led you to target a Northern Light toward a young adult audience? How did you come to be interested in writing for that particular audience?
Again, I think it was just it was reading Grace's letters. It was understanding her story. For people who aren't familiar with Grace Brown and Chester Gillette, Grace was a young woman who fell in love. She was a farm girl from central New York State, and she went to work in a factory nearby her farm, and there she met the nephew of the factory owner, Chester Gillette, and they sparked up a romance, and Grace fell in love, and one thing led to another, and Grace found herself pregnant. So in 1906, at the age of 19, if you were unmarried, an unmarried young woman, and you were pregnant, you were in a great deal of trouble. Grace was hoping Chester would do the right thing by her and marry her, but he had other ideas. He was sort of, he wanted to trade up a bit. He wanted to find a girl who was a little higher up in the social hierarchy and court her. So Grace left her job and the factory town. She went back to her farmstead, pregnant, scared, not sure what she was going to do. And she wrote these letters to Chester, and sort of begging him, sometimes nagging him to do the right thing by her. And the letters are just these amazing portraits of what it was like to be a 19-year-old girl in 1906. And you can sense her despair. You can hear her despair in the words, and you can hear her frustration. And then in the very last letter, by this time, Chester has agreed to meet with Grace, and they're going to go up into the Adirondacks. I'm sure Grace was hoping in some part of her that this was going to turn out to be a good thing. Maybe Chester would marry her, or maybe at least take care of her until she could have the baby, perhaps put it up for adoption. But I think another part of her understood that this was not going to turn out well for her, because in this very last letter, she writes about saying goodbye. Goodbye to all the places she's loved as a child. Goodbye to neighbors. She has talked in her letters about what it's like to be 19 and sort of, shooting off firecrackers with friends and trying to cook a meal for her family and picking strawberries. And I defy anyone to read this last letter of Grace's without just weeping. It is that sad. You know what's coming. I think she knows what's coming. And she has a line in it where she says, words to the effect, "And Mama, if only I could tell her what was going on with me, but I can't. I know it would break her heart." And to think of this teenage girl alone with nobody, nobody to turn to, nobody to help her, nobody to confide in, That just broke my heart. And I wanted to, again, I wanted to have something good. I needed to have something good come out of this tragedy of Grace's death. And that something good is Maddie. She wants, to have a life too, and she wants to break free. And what she finds in Grace's letters, Grace hands those letters to Maddie shortly before her death, gives Maddie the strength to break free and go on and live her life. And I wanted to share that, with a teenage audience very, very much.
You and I grew up in a relatively similar region in New York State, and growing up late in the 20th century, that story was still very prevalent in that part of the state.
Absolutely. I mean, my grandmother worked in a great camp next to the Glenmore, and she knew the story, and even my cousins, heard about Grace Brown and the fact that she haunts the lake. It's still very, very present, and when you go to Big Moose Lake, you very much feel Grace Brown's spirit still there. At least I do.
No, you really do. You really do. I want to switch gears. I want to talk a little bit about how you approach your work as a writer. What's your daily creative routine? Do you have one?
It's basically get started as quick as I can, as early in the day as I can, and go as long as I possibly can. I've been on a schedule since about 2012 now to put out a book a year.
Wow.
So there isn't a lot of time to mess around. So I try to get down to it. Before I start a book, I outline extensively, and that's not the sort of, ABC sort of outline. It's, the outline for the book I'm working on now is actually more of a treatment. It was probably about 45, 50 single-spaced pages.
Wow.
And I just sort of work out scene after scene after scene. If I hear the dialogue, I put it in. If I can see the setting, I put it in. The action between the characters is always present so that I have a good flight plan by the time I sit down and really start to write, because I just really can't afford, to spend time going off down the wrong road with that deadline constantly pressing in.
Are you a journaler? Do you have other outlets that you're writing into?
No, I've had enough writing after a whole day of it. The last thing I want to do is sit down and plumb my own thoughts in a journal. I want to get up, take a walk, do something other than write.
Are you able to write all day? You talked about getting started as soon as you can. Are you a morning writer? Are you?
I would say my best work is done in the morning, but I've often done, decent work in the afternoon and way into the evenings.
Wow.
And by writing, I don't mean sitting there, typing word after word after word after word. It's struggling. It's looking out of the window. It's getting out, a notebook or paper and trying to get this plot to come right. So it's not always achieving. Some writers have a set quota. I'm going to write 5 pages. I'm going to write 1,500 words, whatever it is. I've never done that or been able to do it. I just try to advance as much as I can. A lot of my stories are very, very, if not all, plot driven, and there are a lot of characters that they're big sort of broiling stories. So I'm very much looking. Has this character spent too much time on stage? Have we not heard of that character? What is the pacing like? It's almost like listening to music and trying to understand, am I hearing too much of the oboes? I need more trumpets in there. It's trying to get that rhythm correct. So yeah, the days are not always productive in word count, but they're productive perhaps in advancing the plot or coming to understand a character more deeply.
You're active on Twitter, and several months ago now you shared what I thought was an absolutely fascinating time-lapse video depicting the process. I'm glad you like that. Did you know the one I'm talking about?
Yes, I do.
Depicting the process that you go through as you plot a novel. So for listeners who haven't seen that video, can you describe what that process entails for you and why or how you find it beneficial?
Sure. This process was me. I have a large dining room table that I bought. My husband and I bought at an auction house, and
which you've danced on with champagne.
Not the same one, no.
Oh, okay.
And so I unrolled a huge piece of paper and climbed up on the table and just started putting down the ideas that I had in my head for the book I'm working on right now. And my husband was able to film it because there's a little sort of walkway, balcony at the top of our dining room, and he did a time lapse of it. And it gives kids and older readers too, I hope, some idea of just the sort of physicality of plot. It's this, it's that, then it's this, then it's lines coming together. Sometimes you can do it in logical order, and sometimes you can't. Sometimes you know a scene towards the end or a scene towards the middle, and you work from the middle to the beginning or the end up to the middle. But it is work, and it's logic, and it's figuring things out, and it's thinking. It's not just sitting down at your keyboard and magically all these words come out of your hands. When I was a kid, My mom used to like to watch the show Murder, She Wrote with Angela Lansbury, and the whole thing opens with, you know, the detective writer sitting there typing out, you know, word after word after word. And for a long time, I thought that's what writing was. And if I couldn't do that, then I wasn't a writer. But that's only part of it. You know, so much of it is thinking and grinding and crossing out and starting over and erasing. And no, this plot line, you know, is resolving in nothing. It doesn't work. Or this character is spending way too much time on the page. I need to hear from someone else. It's just very much an exercise of logic and structure and almost sort of physics at times. Yeah, it's. I hope your listeners will go online. It's Jen Writes Books, I think, across all my social media platforms, and it's pinned to the top of Twitter. It's also on my Facebook page, and it will give them, you know, in a nutshell, kind of a clear idea of my plotting process.
I was actually going to say, people need to go on and see this because it's fascinating. I've watched this thing so many times, and when you say that you have a large dining room table, you have a large dining room table.
It is a large dining room table. It's very fun at holidays.
I can imagine. And this is like a huge sheet of almost like butcher paper that you've got extended down the table, and you're up on top of it. You're kind of crawling around and writing and scribbling out. I had never thought of, you made the point, it almost sort of speaks to the physicality of plot.
Yeah, very much so.
Which is something I'd never really thought of that.
Yes, it does. And that's what plot is. What happens? You know, what is happening to these characters? What do they want? What's in their way? What is the conflict? How are they getting there? And it is watching them move around the page. It is a very physical thing.
So when you're done with that, do you have basically the book laid out, or at least a rough structure of the entire book from start to finish laid out?
I have a rough structure. I have a skeleton, and then a lot has to go on to that skeleton. It needs, you know, the ligaments, and it needs the flesh, and it needs all the arteries, and it still needs a lot more. But I have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and I can work from that. It gives me the confidence. I'm a very neurotic, underconfident writer, so that gives me the confidence. Okay, I've got something here. I can build this. I can keep going. And then I drag that sheet of paper upstairs to my office, and I sit down at my computer and start fleshing that out.
I've got to go back for a second. Jennifer Donnelly is an underconfident writer?
Totally. Oh my gosh.
Really?
Totally.
Really?
Absolutely. I think I'm on 13th or 14th novel, and it feels like the first novel. You know, it feels like I'm starting over. Like I don't know what I'm doing. And where did this, you know, so-called talent that I have desert me this time? Am I going to be able to find it again? Every single book, you know, sort of puts you through the ringer, makes you suffer, makes you into, you know, a beginner again.
Well, you've given hope to me. Because every time I sit down at the computer to write, honestly, it's almost a feeling of fear.
Absolutely.
As I'm looking at the blank page, it's a feeling of fear.
Yeah. It's fear, it's panic, it's discomfort, it's oh my gosh, it's all those things. And so that people are well within their rights to ask, then why do you do it? I will say, you know, not to complain here nonstop, the joy of it when it's working and it's going and it's coming together. And then, you know, you touch somebody writes to you and says, you know, this changed my life. Sometimes with Revolution, one or two people wrote and said, this saved my life. That is an amazing feeling. And that makes, you know, all the storm and drang worthwhile. And
as you're writing, is that butcher paper that you've worked on, is that in your office near you?
That was actually, it was a photographer's paper. A photographer came here for a photo shoot and didn't want to take his paper back, so he let me have it, and I put it to good use.
And does it stay in your office somewhere that you're looking at?
It's rolled up in my office closet right now. Okay. I mean, I consulted it at first, but I've in the stage I'm in presently with the new book, I'm sort of beyond that right now and at the writing stage. So I've gone on from that piece of paper.
Okay, that's what I wondered, is if that paper is sort of a living document that you're going back to, and you know, as you're in the act of writing, going back and scratching out and trying to sort of replot the story as you're working.
No, it's become something bigger, longer, more detailed, more intricate on my computer at this point. So that's what I'm referring to.
In the acknowledgement section at the end of these shallow graves, you thank New York City for having, I'm going to quote the section here, for having made a writer of the book's protagonist and of me. Mm-hmm. How do you regard New York as having shaped you as a writer?
Oh, it's just, it's such a magical place, and it challenges you and it breaks you, but then it lifts you up again. And there's just inspiration everywhere you look. And of course, the age of the city and the ghosts are for me very, very inspiring. But there's something in the air or the water. There's a hustle, and you really do think, if I work hard enough, if I dream big enough, I can do what I want too. And that's what I felt when I moved there, when I moved to Brooklyn. And I still feel that way when I go there and walk down the sidewalk. It's just such an inspiring place.
It is. And there's an energy there. I've heard a lot of people say what you said, that, friends who've moved to the city that can break you.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's undoubtedly an energy there, too, that can lift you up and inspire you.
Yeah, and it can break you, and it did break me. Believe me, when, I, as I said, worked for 12 years on a book only to have nothing but rejections, I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do now? But you pick up and you go on.
You have a new book, Stepsister.
Yes.
Could you give listeners a sense of what they can expect in that book?
Absolutely. Stepsister picks up where Cinderella leaves off, and it delves into the story of the ugly stepsisters, in particular one, the younger one, Isabel. And it delves into a lot of sort of big questions. When I was a kid, my grandmother read me Cinderella, and I loved it. I had a big Golden Book version of it. I just devoured the tale. I was fascinated by it, but not because of Cinderella. I really, I loved Cinderella and I felt sorry for her. She had such a hard life, but I couldn't really relate to her because she was always so good and so kind, and my 5-year-old self was not. And she was, never rude, never jealous. She was always smiling. Right to the end of the book, when she married this guy who looked older than my dad, as a 5-year-old, I could not understand any of that. But I could understand her ugly stepsisters because, they wanted to sleep in and they didn't want to do their chores, and they were rude and they were often jealous and they were grabby and they wanted things they weren't supposed to want. And, that was a lot more like a 5-year-old. And, long after I closed the cover, my grandmother closed the cover of that book, I wondered about them. What had become of them and what were their lives like? And eventually got to the point where I decided I had to find out. And so that's what I wrote about in Stepsister. I wanted to know, who are these mean girls? And more importantly, what made them mean? Because if you scratch the surface of any mean girls aren't born mean, right? I mean, if you scratch the surface, you find a lot of damage there. So what had damaged them? What had made them, in quotes, ugly? And, who gets to decide who's beautiful? And is there a possibility of taking that definition back? So I was interested in that, and I was interested in the idea of redemption. Is the happily ever after only for the pretty princess, or can a storybook villain ever get a shot at it?
I love that in answering that question, you again brought the subject back to your experience as a child with story, with your grandmother telling you stories.
Absolutely.
And it just speaks to me. We come full circle. And it speaks to me about how deeply interwoven story is in your life.
Very much so. And as I'm talking to you, I feel just so fortunate to have had storytellers, to have had, people who shared their stories with me. My grandmother was a wonderful, very dry, she was Irish, of Irish descent, storyteller as well. And my dad, too, and his whole side of the family. And to have people who showed me the importance of books and read books to me, it was invaluable. I wouldn't be who I am without that. And librarians, I remember as a kid, the first day of kindergarten and just being traumatized. I hated it, and I didn't know anybody, and I didn't know, where to sit or what to say, and I was crying, and somehow made it through the morning. And in the afternoon, we went to the library, and there this lovely woman, I remember her so well, Mrs. Allen. She had this kind, smiling face. She took me by the hand and helped me find the thing, as I've said earlier, I have always turned to in times of trouble, which was a book, and suddenly things didn't look so grim. I remember all my librarians throughout elementary and high school, and what they did for me and how they put books into my hands and into my path. And it's just so important for a child to have those influences.
And God knows that the historical period we find ourselves living in right now, we need books. We need books.
We do need books. Yes, absolutely. And we need books that reflect everybody's story. And oh my gosh, if there's just one thing I want listeners to take away from this, is the importance of story and the importance of books to a child.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just going to say, Stepsister comes out in May. We don't need any reviews. Everything that Jennifer Donnelly does is absolutely fantastic. And if you are not familiar with her work,
Thank you so much, Sean. You are way too kind.
No, you are a literary writer. I have yet to read, and I've read all of your books. I have yet to read anything that you've written that doesn't sweep me away, that doesn't challenge me to think, that doesn't challenge me to be introspective.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's very, very kind of you.
And thank you for taking time out of your day and any time away from writing to talk with me.
My pleasure, and a huge thanks to you, and thanks to your listeners for tuning in.
And that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jennifer. If you like what you heard, please take a moment to tell a friend about the podcast. In the meantime, I look forward to seeing you back here in July, when we'll continue to talk with writers for young adults about the art of storytelling. Till then, happy reading.